afternoon. I'm Dr. Anne Farren, and will be presenting along with my colleague Jonathan Pillai from Curtin University. Welcome to our presentation on sensory experience between the real and the virtual. We both teach in the Bachelor of Design program at the School of Design and the Built Environment at our university, and thank the Design Day Marathon team and organisers for this opportunity. In our country, we have a tradition to acknowledge the country of the traditional owners. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work, the Whadjuk Noongar people. This is where we are situated in Bentley campus. We respectfully acknowledge the elders and custodians past and present, their descendants and kin, and honour these shared places of learning. We similarly acknowledge and pay respect to the First Peoples of the other lands wherever Curtin is located and Curtin activity is conducted. A graceful life needs balance between the real and the virtual experience. This is the hypothesis that we are talking about today. Our presentation today will investigate the importance of maintaining balance between the real and the virtual experience in order to maintain a graceful life, the theme of the Design Day Marathon this year, and an understanding of the significance of sensory experience in both these worlds. So much of what we experience today is through a digital or virtual lens. The experience of Van Gogh's paintings in these two realities are completely different experiences. There is this touring exhibition at the moment of his work through this digital exhibition called Lume. Many of us have had the opportunity to experience both domains, both the real world or the exhibition painting and the digital immersive experience. However, it is important that we do not forget the value of the original work, its intent, and the sensory experience of being in the presence of this artifact that we can see depicted in this slide on the left. But as I mentioned, many of you may have had the opportunity to have the immersive experience of being in the space with this work and other works by Van Gogh. Can we replicate the reality of sensory experience in the digital world? Digital technology today mainly uses two senses, sight and sound, although I'm sure Jonathan will talk more about the changing domain of the virtual. But it may not be long before we can feel, taste and smell digital objects in a way that is indistinguishable from physical experiences. With the fast-paced technological advances in AR and VR applications and the hyperconnectivity of 5G, it is plausible that digital experience will move from screen-based to sense-based experiences in the decades ahead. However, we are still not there, and I always will claim that it is important that we also recognise the importance of the real-world experiences. Maybe it's not about replication, but the understanding of the real and the virtual sensory experiences that need to be understood and their differences. As I watched some of the Design Day Marathon presentations, I was really fortunate to see the organised sound, a tribute concert to Egdag Variz. For me, this illustrated how the two domains can work together and come together to give us a very enriched experience. I watched the digital presentation of movement, sound, and touch that were brought together in a seamless orchestration and performance of the piece in a digital space. The organised sound, a tribute, was a wonderful experience that really illustrated how strongly we need to recognise how well the two domains can work together. In the next slide, We have an image of the cover of a catalogue for an exhibition that I was involved with. It was an exchange exhibition with Eurasia University in Xi'an in their School of Design and Art. The planning began at the end of 2019, and because of COVID, we had to reimagine how this could be presented. The plan had been for the exhibition to be toured from one university to the other. However, it became necessary to consider the digital translation of the works through digital media, so that we could share them. We couldn't physically go and tour the exhibition. So we actually created and had to rethink many of the works, or reimagine many of the works that we had planned for the exhibition. This exhibition explored the perception of artworks and the impact of the digitization of objects, cultural artifacts, and heritage. And I'll just go to some few of the examples that were in this show that I thought speak of this the relationship between the real and the digital world. In this work, Ray Walter, one of the exhibitors and students working on the project, compressed many images that she took of the landscape. For me, the image on the right, it was a digital installation, but she took her view of the world and took multiple images that were compressed to create this image on the right, which for me very much reflects the local landscape. And I have a very strong sense of a sensory experience of the landscape, even though it is filtered through digital media. She digitally compressed her visual experience of the local landscape, and she also worked with a musician to capture and render the compression of sounds that gave a virtual experience of the landscape around her. Another example, in my work, I'm moving into my area of fashion and textiles, so I wanted to use this work as, again, to illustrate where I come from and the significance for me of touch and the tactile. The work that I produced for this exhibition was about the tactile nature of surface and cloth. For me, touch is critical to the making and presentation of the work. However, for this exhibition, I had to consider how the work could be translated through digital media. The machine embroidered lace component in the center was translated through photographic image, and it was also translated through laser cutting, digitization of the machine embroidery into a laser pattern that was then digitally sent to Eurasia, and they were able to reproduce this in their space. So I suppose for me, it became an interesting way to render a sense of surface via the laser cutting interpretation or translation of the original work, which is depicted in the center and is machine embroidered lace. As I mentioned, I work in fashion. I teach in the fashion school, even though my background is very strongly textile. But textile is a really important component of garment and fashion. So we've got fashion sits very strongly in a tangible world. It is what clothes us. It wraps around our body. We have a sensory experience of clothing on an everyday basis. So I work not only in textiles but in fashion, where we're in a very sensory space. What is at stake with this approach is that vision reduces identity to appearance, leaving aside regards of embodied subjectivity, what is also related to pleasure and emotion it might elicit. So we can have the sensory experience of the object, but we also need to be aware of the emotional connection to garment that comes from the sensory experience of wearing the cloth. So as we move into or transition into talking more about the virtual world of fashion, it is very much a reality that we are moving. Fashion is moving into the digital space in the virtual world, and in many respects, I'm sure this is a good thing, as long as we do remember the foundations of what I was speaking about in the previous slide. Is that we do have such an intimate connection to the garments that we wear in fashion. And we need to consider that this is the user, the person is wearing this object. So as a designer of garment, increasingly, I can use the virtual world and an avatar to explore fit. However, there is knowledge of the wearer experience that can only be gained from knowledge of real-world experience of materials and of the making and wearing of a garment. Companies such as Chloe are providing the opportunity for fashion design to exist in the virtual world. It is providing cost-saving and sustainable options for the fashion industry. However, it is important to remember that ultimately the object needs to also exist in the real world for real people, and all the complexities of the human wearer to be considered. However, there is a virtual world for fashion to exist in, and I think that this is a good point at which to hand over to my colleague, Jonathan. Sorry, I've jumped to a slide. I missed a couple of slides. But Jonathan will talk more about this in his part of the presentation. So what I wanted to also do is just to give an example here of one of our students who is working in this space, and how we use or encourage our students to work in both domains, the real and the virtual. As our students move into this virtual design space, we encourage movement between the two domains to ensure engagement in the understanding of both the real and the virtual experience of making process, and including both design and prototype production. And this is what companies like Chloe are doing, is they are giving this opportunity for cost savings, as I said before, sustainability of not having to produce many iterations of an object or to have prototypes that maybe don't work. It can be tested in this virtual space. So this is probably the point at which we will hand over to Jonathan, but I was interested to find that GoVizTech predict that the metaverse will become as real and common as the internet in the future. Users will be able to connect to different metaverses and to their avatars. I think this might already be happening, Jonathan, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think, but you've provided some really interesting points that sort of lead into where I'm going to jump into as well. And I think one of the things you said, Anne, was that there is a need to be in touch with the real world, and like how you were saying, the experience of the garment on the person. And I think that's while obviously I'm in the animation and game space, it is very similar as well, as in the sense that for something to actually be immersive and playful, we need to be in touch with what playfulness and meaningfulness actually mean in the real world as well. And that maybe allows me to jump into my segment and to consider what it means to be in the virtual world, I guess. And as you say, and a lot of things are transitioning. I found it really interesting as you put up that slide, the last slide about the metaverse and how fashion itself is transitioning, and you see virtual runways and shows, fashion shows in the virtual world now. And with the metaverse, of course, we are even starting to see people get a sense of identity of clothes, but in the virtual world, which is really interesting. And I think if we were to consider that media is an extension of man, and in that sense, if we think about the immersive VR world, it extends not just our senses, but also our sense of self into a new world. And I think that's really interesting because, as you were talking about it, it really struck me that sense of self and identity is carried into a new world. And in this world, we try and create this world that, in a way, that mimics the real world, but there's also a point where people actually want to go into this space where it goes beyond reality and it goes beyond the real world. And that's part of the draw as well. Part of the draw of being in a virtual world is not that it's exactly like the real world, but there are certain things that you can do in the virtual world which sort of go beyond. And here's an example of something that we did. And this was a project that a colleague and I worked on in 2019 with some students as well. And we were in a beautiful building. And in this beautiful building, you could experience this building, of course, walking around it. And it's a very interesting building. But what we did was we pulled this into VR. We actually projected it, and we had the exact heights, and we sort of mapped the entire space in VR exactly the same as the real world. So when you were sitting in the set, before you switched the set on, and once you switched it on, and when you went into the 3D world, as you can see in the second image, the sense of the virtual world, it felt exactly the same like the real world. But the way we pushed it beyond the real world was we started to transform, and you can see artifacts in the middle picture where it's starting to transform, and we transformed this entire space into this really beautiful garden with mountains and little creatures and stuff like that. And it was really interesting to see that connection where people could connect the real world, of course, which is this beautiful building, the interior of this building called 211, but then dive into another world altogether and being drawn into this world where they could then say, wow, I want to be even further. I want to dive even further, because it sort of evoked certain responses in them. This next slide sort of pulls this sort of point together a bit more. People still want to experience that suspension of disbelief, the stuff that actually pulls them into a game-like experience or an immersive experience. It's really the stuff that, hey, wait a minute, I can't really do this in real life, but it's sort of real. And I think in the virtual world, that's the kind of design that hooks people in and drives that sense of emotion. And you'll find that people want emotionally driven experiences which invade their senses. So this particular experience, and it's called Richie's Plank experience. It's really interesting because you sort of have to conquer your fears. And I don't know about you, Anne, but I would have been really worried walking. Yeah, and what they did was they obviously you have a plank and you walk out on that plank, but it's in VR. But it was amazing to see how nervous people were. And of course, you can download this. It's available as a experience, as a game. And it was all about conquering their fears. But it was amazing how, this suspension of disbelief that you could walk on this plank, which is sticking out of the building. And when you look down, you see you would have never been able to do this in real world, right? It's just not safe. But that's the beauty of actually designing the experiences in a way which connects the real world, but pushes you beyond reality to some extent. One of the things that you could argue is that perhaps creating this delightful experience, perhaps creating an experience which draws you in, right? We could and we should consider how it's playful, gameful, and meaningful all at the same time as it connects with our senses between the physical and the virtual world. I've got these 3 examples here, and they are sort of really different examples. The first one is an example that I enjoy with my kids. I actually play with this, but it's funny because although it's a game, and you play a song according to the beat, and you have these little lightsabers, and it's in the virtual world, what's really interesting is your whole body moves, and it's so playful and it's so gameful, and you really get absorbed. And not only that, for me, it gave me a real sense of nostalgia because I was using this thing, and it reminded me of a movie I love, Star Wars, with the lightsabers as well. And so from an emotional point of view, it was connecting for me from a physical point of view because I was still being physical in the real world, but I had that sense of nostalgia through the graphics I was seeing or the aesthetics in the virtual world. Another example, which is using class VR, and this is another example of how, if you consider playful, gameful, or meaningful, it draws you in. And this was a representation of the Egyptian tombs, and you could actually walk through this entire Egyptian museum and be really immersed and touch the tombs. And I think what was really interesting about this particular experience was that In this sense, it was not playful or gameful, I'd say, but it was meaningful. It drew you into a world that you couldn't be into. The last example I have there is actually a research project that we're still working on, and it's a collaboration with Unity Technologies and Curtin. And I thought, well, the reason why I wanted to share this particular experience or this VR experience that we're building is because this experience it drew us into land that was what I would say it's a representation of Australia, you know, years and years ago. And it draws you into the country, it draws you into a connection with the land. And part of it as well, it's actually still stylized in a way that's still not realistic, but it draws you into this space where you could sit calmly by the fire. And in fact, what was really interesting in this experience when we were testing it out is a lot of people went by the fire and they wanted to experience the warmth of the fire. And it was so interesting because one of the things that we spoke about was, could you imagine if we could connect that to a sensor that allowed you to experience heat? So that would bridge the real world and this digital world as well. Now, when we consider designing this experience, and I think this is something for us to consider as we think about balancing this sort of experience and this sensory experience in the virtual world, perhaps it's good to think about it in terms of how we approach it and leveraging on some of the design frameworks that we can use to think about these experiences or to ideate these experiences. Obviously, with my background from game design, I've been very informed in my design approach through the lens of game design. And when I think of a virtual environment, obviously, for me, I'm slightly more informed from the perspective of a game designer looking at it. So the gamified experience of it. And you could argue that you could leverage on a framework which Jesse Shell popularly sort of came out with, which is a 4-elemental tetrad. And it requires you to consider the aesthetics, the mechanics, and the mechanics are basically what you do. The aesthetics are your sound, your tactile, so your touch to some extent in the virtual world, and obviously your visual. And of course, the technology is where you try and bridge and you push new technology in to sort of bridge that gap between what's real and what's virtual. And narrative. Obviously, the reason why you need to consider narrative is because just like Anne was talking about, that there are experiences that we live and we encounter in the real world, and story is one of them. You know, we all have stories, and so it's really important to consider this aspect of narrative. So we could say that if we were to consider using this tetrad, the aesthetics, and so how it looks and feels, and how you can make that world, in a way, a world that brings you into that suspension of disbelief, and also consider mechanics. So what is it that I can or cannot do in the real world that perhaps I can do in this virtual world? Technology. So one of the examples was if I could have sensors, if I could generate heat, if I could generate touch, and of course narrative. If there's a story behind this that draws upon my emotions and my own cultural or historical or social perspectives that can inform a connection to the space. And I guess if we were to sort of pull this together, and I've put 2 examples here, you could argue that we could really evoke emotions, build a connection between the person, the created world, and the real world. And these 2 examples, if you look at the VR Funhouse, it sort of really brings this emotion of nostalgia and going back to the old school Funhouse when I can play games and I can jump in there. And I can shoot things, and there's no end to this. And then of course you have the flip one, which is real VR fishing, which brings you into a relaxed environment, and it mimics the real world, where the graphics are literally like the real world. But it's not very often that we can travel out to the lake or to the river or the seaside. But this allows you to be transported into that place and actually go through that process of fishing. And actually, in this game, it's quite tangible as well. You actually swing, and you can get a sense of the vibration when you catch fish. So you can see how the technology and the narrative, the mechanics, all of these come together to give you that relaxation and fun in real VR fishing. One of the things I wanted to sort of, as we head towards our conclusion, one of the things I did want to put forward as well is that an immersive experience needs to have its connection to the real world, and it needs to go past some of the boundaries of the real world. And it also needs to consider very carefully what it means to have movement and this sense of embodiment, where my body is part of it, and I can move in this physical movement. Because we all move in the real world. We don't just sit in front of the computer. And I think considering how I can move in the virtual environment, or how it can be embodied, like through touch or even through gestures, these are actually important things to consider. Think about the virtual world, and of course, a connection to memory. One of the most beautiful things, obviously, that being in the virtual world is it allows you to draw on a vault of memories or nostalgia, or things that evoke a sense of emotion and connection to the past or the future, even. And I think this is really for us to think about emotional and embodied, and that's something that's important to design as we consider the virtual world. As this heads towards the future, and we think about designing deeper emotional and embodied experiences, we can see in research out there, and for example, in Carnegie Mellon, one of the research projects that they're doing, which is really interesting, is really giving a sense of tactile feedback. So you can imagine being able to feel a sculpture, or Anne, I can imagine being able to feel cloth and garments in my hand while being in the virtual world. Microsoft Research has done this really interesting, and they're still researching this project, where people appear right in front of you like a holograph, or a hologram, and you can communicate with them, and they're actually projected into your physical space, so they obey your sense of space as well, which is mind-boggling because it sort of blurs the lines a bit. And of course, you can see this quite often now, VR in medicine, where practitioners are practicing on sort of this augmented reality dummies, and they're actually doing the operation in real time, and that's part of their training as well. So I think that there is, when you consider the future of VR and where it's actually moving towards this deeper emotional and embodied experience, it's really important for us to consider, okay, well, how do we also balance all of this? And I think, for me, when I think about it, and to sort of conclude and put this picture together, I think it's obviously, we have a design framework where we can consider the aesthetics, the mechanics, and technology and the narrative. And if we focus on emotions and embodiment, it allows us to draw and pull people into this world. But I think, as we explore and understand all of this, it's really important to also have a balance and to consider the experiences of the real world, how it translates, and to some extent, not even to augment the real world and not take away from the real world. And I think as we consider that, and as we consider what it means to create this meaningful experience, I think then it draws us closer to this idea of a graceful life. And I'm going to stop here because I've said a lot, and I wonder whether we could, if there are any questions, or if you have any thoughts as well, Anne.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is really interesting about us coming together is that I come from a very non-digital, non-virtual space. So my reality is very much embedded in the physical space, and I understand the need to use it and work with it, and I'm intrigued. But I have to admit, I have never played a game in my life.
Yeah.
So I have never been in the virtual space myself. I have had to go with the design, and I see lots of potential in fashion for the design space. But I think I have a healthy skepticism about to what extent can it replace the real world? And also my skepticism around, should we replace the real world? To what extent because you hear of people who pretty much have a preference to live in the virtual as opposed to the real world. What does that mean for us as human beings? So that's the kind of the question that I would always throw out for people to consider and discuss and think about. But yeah, I'm interested to hear how, because Jonathan, you're in that game space, your commitment, your world is formed by a real intimate knowledge and an understanding of of that space. And I'm probably the opposite spectrum, which is, I think, a good thing for us to. We have always had chats about it, and I'm very enthusiastic to make sure our students understand how they can use it. I'm definitely one that would hate to think that I would block or not encourage it, but I think I'm also in a healthy space of saying, yeah, but let's make sure it's working properly.
Yeah, and I think, and just to respond slightly to that, I think what's really interesting is, this picture that I'm using in the background where it's a warm fire. The reality is, I think that the virtual world and the way we design it, while we make it more realistic and while we push boundaries of the experiences and the connection and all of that, I think part of, at least for me as a designer, to me, the meaningfulness of the experience becomes good only if it draws you back to the real world, not
Yes.
away from it.
Yes.
So I think as I feel this fire, as I feel the warmth of this fire, my hope is that you'll then come out of this and say, wow, I really want to experience this for real. I really want to. Or if it sparks a memory, it then translates into the real world. Because I think that that I would say conundrum, and the reason why I say conundrum, because I think nowadays there are some people who say, look, the virtual world is great, let's live there. There is that reality and there is a group of people that speak about how they purposefully blur the lines, and they don't. I find it problematic, even though I'm part of the digital world. But some people would say, look, that's the future, but I would argue that actually the future is a digital world that fits into the real world, not the other way around. And I think that's where it's really important to consider the way you design. And that's why it's really important to think about, as you translate certain things, we have to be cognizant, as you say, of what can or cannot be translated into from real to sort of this virtual world, because there will be some things that we can't translate, and maybe we can get close to it, but there may be a point where we say, look, we have gotten close enough, let's go and get the real thing, and of course there are some scenarios where not getting the real thing is good. So like safety, for example, I think that's a great example of how the virtual world can be used in a positive way, where we don't have to throw ourselves in front of a bus to know that that's going to hurt. But these are all design considerations that, as we design, we need to be conscious of.
Well, I really connected to when you talked about building 201 and the experience, enhancing that experience, that it was different to the experience of physically being in the building, and provided other alternate experience of that place and that space. Because with Light and Shadow exhibition, we were also looking at how we could provide and share the experience of the exhibition that was more than it was when you went into the physical space of the exhibition. So we used Matterport to include documentation of the work, detail of the work. So you could go in there and hear exhibitors talk about their work, which wasn't, if you were lucky enough that the exhibitor was there, then you had that personal experience of chatting to them about it. But at least the virtual environment of this Matterport visit meant that you could experience, or you still can, click on their work and hear what they have to say about the work that they've created. So yeah, I definitely engage in that sort of space and find that really a positive element of the digital experience and space. But yeah, I'll be interested. I think there's for fashion, there's two domains. There's like we've discussed previously, that there's a whole world that exists whereby you can be designing for that virtual world. So that our students and our graduates can be working in it. It provides a whole new world for a designer to live and work. Which is strange to say, isn't it?
And I think what's really interesting as well, Anne, is that and vice versa, as they enter into, let's say, the metaverse or the virtual world, how do they then take that and sort of plug it back into the real world? I mean, I know there are some people now who are sort of creating stuff through Flow and through all the other 3D software, and then once they have it out in the virtual world, they sell it as part of the digital content, and people who buy it can actually digitally print out the garment or the artifact that they're selling. And that's something to consider as well, where it's it's this journey of from the real to the virtual and then back out to the real again.
Yes, yeah. When you were talking about the experience in the digital world as well, or virtual world, you spoke about how do you get or translate that sensory experience. And many years ago, I was working in the space of embedding digital data or embedding technology into garment, and there is more work in that space now, even still continuing, in terms of how do we stimulate the senses through garment. So it could be that a garment that is designed in the real world has characteristics or technology that will enhance the virtual world experience. So there's definitely potential for those two worlds to cross over and inform each other and enhance each other. Yeah.
Awesome.
So on that note, maybe we should, I'm not sure if there's an opportunity for questions or whether we close off on this at this point. We'll leave that to the coordinators, I think.
Yep.
Maybe we should leave. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I do see on the comments there's some.
Is there some comments or questions?
On the comments, and that exciting. There's some emojis there, but well, if there are any questions, I guess
we're definitely happy to take any questions, because I can't see them. So if there's any there that you think comments, Jonathan.
I'm just opening it up. No comments. So, no questions yet. So
okay. Okay, so maybe we should wind up and say thank you to the Design Day Marathon team. It's been really great for us, even the time that it brings us from the same campus together through this digital domain. And we look forward to working with the students in the workshop component on the Curtin project. So thanks to Jonathan. Thank you to the organisers and for Design Day Marathon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.